The room was dim, lit only by the sterile glow of monitors. Outside, the forest surrounding Serpukhov 15 was quiet, just another night shift in the Soviet Union's top-secret early warning command center. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sipped his tea, eyes scanning telemetry data from the Oko satellite constellation orbiting high above Earth. It was September 26, 1983, a Monday. At Oropou, 14 hours. The silence shattered. A piercing alarm wailed through the control room. One of the screens turned blood red, flashing in bold Cyrillic missile launch detected. A single intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the continental United States, according to satellite data. Then another. Then a third. 5 total. Fired from Minuteman silos. The computer system had no doubts this was not a drill. Petrov froze. Protocol was clear. He was to immediately report the alert to the chain of command, triggering the Soviet nuclear retaliation procedures. Within minutes, hundreds of warheads would be armed, targeted, and launched across the Arctic toward the United States. But something didn't add up. Only 5 missiles. If the Americans were launching a first strike, it wouldn't be 5. It would be hundreds thousands designed to wipe out the Soviet leadership and command and control nodes in one overwhelming blow. This pattern made no sense. Across the world, in NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain complex, it was business as usual. No sirens, no alerts. The United States had not launched anything. Back in the Soviet bunker, every second counted. Petrov wiped sweat from his brow. A junior officer stared at him, waiting for a command. The blinking light continued. The red lettering pulsed like a heartbeat. The pressure was unbearable. Petrov made a choice. He reported it as a false alarm. No retaliation was ordered, no missiles launched, no cities burned. Minutes passed, then hours. The screen returned to green. No impact, no war, just silence. It was only later, after deep analysis, that the truth emerged. High-altitude clouds over North Dakota had reflected sunlight in such a way that the Oko satellite mistook it for missile exhaust. It was a once-in-a-century coincidence, a cosmic error. But it nearly caused the end of human civilization. The world never knew. The archives remained sealed. Even Petrov's own superiors downplayed the incident, embarrassed by how close they had come to catastrophe. But inside the Soviet command, one terrifying truth lingered like radiation. Their system had failed. And no one, not even the men who built it, knew how close they'd come to launching Armageddon based on a phantom. It would take years before the West learned what really happened that night. Years before history could assign a name to the man who didn't press the button. And years before the world understood how dangerously fragile nuclear deterrence had become. The Soviet war room wasn't filled with lunatics. It was filled with logic. Every chart, every doctrine, every war game the Kremlin had run since the late 1960s pointed to one conclusion: if the West launched a nuclear strike, it would be sudden, total, and merciless. The idea of a gradual buildup or limited first strike didn't exist in Soviet planning. Their assumption was binary. Either there was peace or there was annihilation. By 1983, that logic had hardened into paranoia. The new American president, Ronald Reagan, had branded the Soviet Union the evil empire. NATO had begun deploying Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe systems capable of reaching Moscow in under 10 minutes. From the Kremlin's perspective, it looked like a countdown. Inside the Politburo, Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff, warned his peers that the U.S. might attempt a decapitation strike, one aimed at severing Soviet command and control before a counterattack could be launched. That threat demanded a system that could react instantly. Enter the Soviet launch-on-warning doctrine. It wasn't just policy, it was law. If early warning systems detected a credible American missile launch, Soviet command was expected to respond before impact. The retaliation had to be automatic, nearly instinctual. There would be no time for debate, no margin for reflection. Survival demanded speed. But that system had a flaw. It assumed that the American mindset mirrored the Soviet one, that Washington would never risk a small, limited strike, that if the U.S. acted, it would act in totality. The Soviets built their doctrine on this assumption, never considering that their enemy might think differently. And then there was NATO's Able Archer 83, an annual military exercise, yes, but to Soviet intelligence, it looked like camouflage. The scale, the realism, the inclusion of nuclear release protocols, all of it mirrored what a real U.S. first strike might look like. Agents in East Germany reported unusual communications activity. Air bases showed signs of higher alert. To the west, it was a simulation. To the east, it looked like a countdown. This was the room of wrong assumptions where strategy was built on mirror imaging, and war plans hinged on the enemy behaving exactly as expected. But the U.S. wasn't operating by Soviet logic. It never had. And that dissonance, the mismatch between two nuclear philosophies, would lead the Soviet command closer and closer to a fatal mistake. So when a computer at Serpukhov 15 blinked red, it didn't just trigger alarms. It validated every fear the Soviets had nursed in secret. They believed it was real because they had already convinced themselves it would be. The Soviet launch-on-warning doctrine was forged in fear, tested in paranoia, and trusted with blind faith. At its core was a simple, terrifying logic. If American missiles were detected inbound, retaliation had to begin before impact. Not after, not during, but before. The assumption was that any delay would risk total obliteration of Soviet command centers, strategic missile forces, and political leadership. That doctrine wasn't a bluff. It was codified in policy, drilled into officers, cemented into war games. The Soviets had invested heavily in early warning infrastructure, massive phased-array radar stations, like those at Olenogorsk and Skrunda, ground-based infrared sensors, and the Oko satellite system in geosynchronous orbit. These systems were designed to feed data in real time to a single purpose: detect the American first strike and respond before the warheads landed. But here was the flaw. A system designed to react instantly must also trust instantly. No room for doubt, no time for secondary confirmation. If the satellite said launch, the human had to say yes. And if that human hesitated, the whole doctrine collapsed under its own urgency. That was the pressure bearing down on Colonel Stanislav Petrov in 1983. His console didn't offer probabilities, it gave absolutes. Launch detected, 5 missiles, all data checked out, no faults logged. From the system's perspective, the decision was already made. And yet, Petrov stalled. He knew the system's technical limits. He understood that a single satellite misreading the infrared heat signature of the sun glinting off high-altitude clouds could mimic a missile launch. He also understood that 5 missiles didn't fit the profile of a real American first strike. In that moment, Petrov didn't just question the satellite data, he questioned the entire doctrine. Because what if the system was wrong? What if it had been built to respond faster than reason could catch up? This was the danger of the Soviet approach. They had built an unstoppable mechanism designed for maximum speed, but forgot that speed demands absolute clarity. And in the chaos of real-time warfare, clarity is a myth. In contrast, the American nuclear response architecture had built-in delay designed to give decision-makers minutes, even hours, to confirm data across multiple channels. Dual confirmation, human-in-the-loop safeguards, redundancy. The Soviets had none of that in their launch-on-warning tier. Their system operated on the assumption that technology would be perfect and that humans wouldn't second-guess it. Petrov's hesitation, then, wasn't just rare, it was mutiny by reason, and had he followed protocol, the Soviet response would have begun. Submarine-launched missiles, Mobile IRBMs, bomber crews launched from icy runways. U.S. early warning would have detected a launch, and the Americans certain it was real would have fired back. This was the edge where doctrine, automation, and miscalculation met. And in 1983, one man's refusal to obey may have been the only thing that prevented the Cold War from turning thermonuclear. On September 26, 1983, at 00, 14 hours Moscow time, the unthinkable happened. A flashing red alert lit up the console at Serpukhov 15, the Soviet satellite-based early warning center south of Moscow. A satellite in the Oko constellation had detected the unmistakable infrared signature of a missile launch from the United States. The alert escalated in seconds. Not one, not two, but 5 missiles launched in sequence arced over the Earth's curvature, on paths consistent with intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed directly at Soviet territory. This was the first impossible event, because Soviet war doctrine had long held that the United States would only strike with overwhelming force. Hundreds of warheads, a massed launch, not 5, and yet the system said it was happening. Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat in front of the flashing screen, flanked by junior officers who looked to him for confirmation. He was the duty officer that night, the man responsible for interpreting data and escalating alerts to Soviet high command. But Petrov hesitated. He considered the mechanics of the Oko system. It used infrared detection, scanning for the heat bloom of missile exhaust against the blackness of space. But it only had one layer of verification. No radar corroboration, no cross-check from ground systems, only a satellite, and a line of code that translated photons into catastrophe. He also thought about doctrine. The Americans, he believed, would never fire 5 missiles. A real attack would be all or nothing. 5 warheads would be a warning, not a decapitation. It made no strategic sense. Still, the alarm blared. The red light flashed. The report sat in his hand, unsigned. All Petrov had to do was say, "Confirmed." That single word would have triggered a preemptive nuclear response. Retaliation orders would flow from Moscow to mobile missile launchers, submarine fleets, and long-range bombers. Warheads would be in the air in minutes, and the world would change forever. But Petrov made a decision no algorithm could predict. He marked the alert as a false alarm. He took the blame onto himself, risking court-martial, demotion, even treason charges, because there was no protocol for not reporting the alert. He didn't just break the rules, he shattered them. Then, he waited. Minutes passed. Then 15. Then 30. Nothing hit. No mushroom clouds bloomed on the horizon. No retaliatory launches from NATO forces. The system was wrong. The Earth was still turning. Later, Soviet investigators would trace the false alarm to an ultra-rare alignment of high-altitude clouds and sunlight, creating an infrared reflection that mimicked missile launches. A 1-in-a-million atmospheric fluke. But in that moment, there was no such explanation. Only a man, a blinking console, and a decision that saved civilization. Petrov didn't stop World War III with technology. He stopped it with judgment. And judgment was never part of the Soviet launch algorithm. When the initial report reached the upper tiers of Soviet command, it wasn't met with praise. It was met with suspicion. The general staff didn't applaud Petrov's restraint. They interrogated it. Why had he failed to follow protocol? Why had he taken it upon himself to overrule a system designed by their best minds? What gave a lieutenant colonel the authority to gamble with the fate of the Soviet Union? To the Kremlin. This was not a story of near-catastrophe avoided. It was an embarrassment. For decades, the Soviet military-industrial complex had poured billions of rubles into its satellite-based early warning systems. Engineers at the Academy of Sciences had promised reliability, security, certainty. The system had been hailed in state briefings as the most advanced of its kind, and now a junior officer was claiming that it had failed. That was unacceptable. Petrov wasn't commended. He wasn't promoted. He was quietly reprimanded for incomplete log entries, an excuse to avoid addressing the real issue. The Soviet Union's first line of nuclear defense had proven itself vulnerable, not to enemy sabotage, but to sunlight. Behind closed doors, top generals argued bitterly. Marshal Akhromeyev, a hardliner and chief of the general staff, reportedly refused to believe that the satellites had erred. He demanded a deeper probe into Petrov's conduct, suggesting that the officer might have been compromised either mentally or ideologically. But other voices pushed back. A classified review of the Oko satellite data revealed that the infrared sensors had, indeed, misinterpreted the sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as multiple missile launches. The system hadn't failed in isolation. It had succeeded in doing exactly what it was built to do: detect launch patterns. The failure was conceptual. The system had no redundancy, no cross-verification with ground radar. It lacked the second layer of confirmation that would have flagged the event as atmospheric noise. The Soviet High Command had trusted a single thread to hold the nuclear fabric together, and that thread had frayed. But admitting that meant rewriting doctrine, overhauling the early warning system, and, most dangerously of all, admitting that nuclear retaliation had nearly been triggered by an optical illusion. So the incident was buried. No official report was ever made public. The officers who had stood watch that night were reassigned. Petrov, though not punished directly, was transferred to a less sensitive post and quietly retired the following year. Years later, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed and fragments of this story emerged, many in the West were stunned not just at the event itself, but at how the Soviet leadership had responded. They hadn't panicked because the system failed. They panicked because someone dared to admit that it had. For Soviet leadership, one uncomfortable fact loomed large: if the early warning system could misinterpret sunlight for a missile launch, what else could it misread? And worse, what if the Americans knew about that vulnerability already, rather than accept the truth staring them in the face? Soviet strategists began to draft a new theory. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a failure of physics. It was deliberate deception. In the weeks following the false alarm, analysts inside the GRU and KGB floated a chilling hypothesis: the Americans had triggered the event on purpose. They had discovered a flaw in the Soviet satellite architecture and exploited it. It was a test, a dry run to observe Soviet reaction time, a psychological probe masquerading as coincidence. This was the wrong theory, but in a regime steeped in secrecy and distrust, it was the more comfortable theory. Hardline generals embraced it instantly. It fit the narrative of American aggression. The notion that Washington's true goal was to lure the Soviet Union into a first-strike mistake, to provoke a nuclear war that would justify NATO's retaliation and eliminate the USSR in one massive blow. To validate this theory, intelligence officers combed intercepted transmissions, satellite feeds, even civilian air traffic logs looking for some pattern, some American maneuver that might suggest coordination. They found nothing. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. To a paranoid command structure already shaken by events like NATO's Able Archer 83 and Reagan's Star Wars initiative, the Petrov incident became a new source of fear. If 5 Phantom missiles could provoke a launch-on-warning scenario, how many other provocations were possible? Soviet planners began to rework contingency operations. Exercises incorporated scenarios involving decoy launches, radar spoofing, and space-based blinding attacks. The focus wasn't on fixing their own systems, it was on countering phantom threats that might not exist. The irony was staggering. The real danger had come from within, from trusting an unverified system with the fate of the world. But the Soviet response was to assume that the Americans were manipulating that very system with precision. It was a lesson unlearned by chasing shadows. Soviet leadership avoided the real issue that their nuclear doctrine, as it stood, was a hair-trigger trap with no human safety net. The wrong theory gave them cover to keep the system intact while deflecting blame onto an adversary that, in this case, had done nothing at all. And in doing so, they guaranteed that the next failure, if it came, would be even worse. If the first wrong theory assumed external sabotage, the second wrong theory was far more insidious. It blamed the human. In the eyes of senior Soviet defense officials, if the satellite alert had been correct even partially, then the most dangerous variable wasn't the Americans, or even the satellite systems. It was Colonel Stanislav Petrov himself. After all, the system was designed for speed and trust. Petrov had introduced a third element, doubt, and that made him a threat. This was the second wrong theory, that the fault wasn't in Soviet technology, but in Soviet loyalty. What if Petrov had been compromised? What if his hesitation wasn't reasoned? But intentional KGB operatives floated these suspicions in hushed meetings. A few reports even speculated that Petrov may have been turned by Western intelligence. Others wondered if he was psychologically unstable, unable to handle the pressure of nuclear command responsibilities. Never mind that Petrov had acted rationally. Never mind that he had saved the lives of millions. In a system obsessed with obedience and hierarchy, rationality was not the priority. Compliance was. The second wrong theory allowed the Soviet command to preserve its doctrine by scapegoating its most inconvenient officer. His refusal to escalate wasn't hailed as heroic. It was framed as dangerous insubordination. Military psychologists were called in to assess the decision. They didn't find defects, but they weren't expected to. Their role was to build a paper trail, a justification for moving Petrov quietly out of the chain of command. The logic was perverse. If Petrov had followed protocol and the missiles had turned out to be real, Soviet retaliation would have launched. The system would have worked flawed, fast, and lethal. But because he paused, questioned, and ultimately chose not to launch, he had exposed that the system required human discretion, a flaw in the Soviet model of warfare. The real threat was that Petrov had proven doctrine could be wrong, and that was politically unacceptable. So the second wrong theory served a dual purpose. It reinforced the illusion of technological infallibility, and it marginalized the human who had dared to think. The officer who saved the world was quietly retired, denied honors, and omitted from official histories for years. In the West, where Petrov would eventually be recognized decades later, his story was one of courage. But in the Soviet Union, his name became a footnote and his judgment a liability. In a nuclear state obsessed with predictability, a thinking man was the most dangerous weapon of all. What happened on September 26, 1983, should have sent shockwaves through every layer of Soviet intelligence. Instead, it triggered an institutional failure that would haunt the USSR until its final breath. The KGB's internal assessments failed to recognize the foundational flaw in the launch-on-warning system. Instead of initiating a systemic overhaul, they doubled down on surveillance on their own officers. The goal wasn't to question the system. It was to identify who else might break the chain as Petrov had, rather than recalibrating doctrine or software. The Soviet Union recalibrated loyalty checks. Meanwhile, in Washington, intelligence operatives analyzing signals traffic from known Soviet radar sites noticed an uptick in defensive drills and encrypted chatter. Something had rattled the system. But it took months before U.S. analysts understood just how close the Soviets had come to launching on a ghost. They never imagined that the cause was a lone man sitting in a bunker with a blinking light. Back in Moscow, the failure to learn from the incident extended beyond Petrov. Multiple senior officers who had supported his assessment were transferred out of strategic roles. Their opinions were no longer welcome. The result was an intelligence structure that fed the leadership what it wanted to hear, not what it needed to know. The culture of fear and ideological rigidity made it nearly impossible for new officers to challenge the systems they inherited. Satellites remained the central pillar of early warning. Redundant systems like ground-based radar triangulation were delayed or ignored, and the idea of inserting human judgment into launch protocols treasonous. The Americans, however, took a different lesson. Shortly after the Petrov incident, U.S. analysts revised their own confidence in Soviet early warning capabilities. They began to suspect correctly that the USSR had a dangerously brittle command and control framework. What looked like strength was, in truth, fragility. A system that could be tricked by sunlight, then nearly launch global war, wasn't robust, it was volatile. This insight shaped U.S. planning during subsequent moments of tension. From Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative to the NATO exercises of Able Archer 83, every decision was now viewed through the lens of Soviet misinterpretation risk. If Soviet command could be spooked by a ghost signal once, they could be spooked again. And next time, the man in the bunker might not hesitate. But the gravest intelligence failure wasn't technical. It wasn't even procedural. It was epistemic. The Soviet system had conditioned its analysts to believe in the perfection of their machines, the loyalty of their doctrine, and the obedience of their officers. When all three were challenged at once, the system refused to adapt. And so, the Petrov incident wasn't archived as a warning. It was buried as an embarrassment. By the time the truth emerged, the Soviet Union had collapsed, brought down not just by economics or ideology, but by its own refusal to listen to the facts staring it in the face. While the Soviet Union struggled to contain the fallout from its near-apocalyptic false alarm, its Cold War adversary, the United States, had already built an entirely different system for one reason: to make sure no one like Petrov ever had to guess. It started with a belief that Soviet planners never shared uncertainty is not a weakness, it's a safeguard. From the very beginning, U.S. nuclear strategy had operated under a different premise. While the Soviets pursued launch on warning, believing that speed was the ultimate advantage, the United States developed a policy of retaliation on confirmation, a deliberate, multi-layered system that placed the burden of verification on both machines and humans. In the underground halls of NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, computers monitored early warning satellites, radar arrays, and ground-based sensors. But the final call was never left to blinking lights alone. Information from DSP satellites was cross-verified by BMEW's radar installations in Alaska, Greenland, and the United Kingdom, an architecture designed to force delay into a process where panic could be fatal. And even then, the ultimate launch authority rested not with a general in a bunker, but with the President of the United States, surrounded by advisors, intelligence analysts, and military aides whose first job was to ask, "Are we sure this wasn't an act of mercy?" It was strategic pragmatism. American planners understood that nuclear war would offer no second chances. If deterrence failed, survival would hinge not on firing first, but on firing accurately, and that meant building a system where false positives couldn't trigger Armageddon. Ironically, it was the U.S. system that treated its own machines with skepticism. Engineers at DARPA and MIT Lincoln Laboratory had warned for years about the dangers of over-automation in early warning systems. Their recommendations were heeded, from false radar echoes to cosmic rays interfering with satellites. The Americans cataloged everything that could go wrong and built in friction to slow the rush to launch. The Soviets saw this as indecisiveness, but in truth, it was insulation from disaster. And it wasn't just systems, it was doctrine. American war plans didn't rely on total centralization. The Strategic Air Command maintained airborne command posts like Looking Glass, capable of assuming launch authority if ground stations were compromised. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles gave the U.S. second strike capability, ensuring no first strike could ever decapitate its response. This multi-pronged resilience made mistakes survivable. It's why, in the summer of 1980, when a faulty 46-cent computer chip falsely triggered a NORAD alert indicating a Soviet launch, the U.S. didn't panic. Human analysts checked crossfeeds, confirmed radar silence, and quickly determined the glitch. No sirens, no launches, no countdown. Where the Soviet system pushed a man like Petrov to make an impossible choice. The U.S. system worked to prevent such choices from ever reaching a single human being without overwhelming evidence. It wasn't perfect, but it was survivable. And that was the core difference. The Soviets built a system that rewarded obedience and punished hesitation. The Americans built one that demanded hesitation and punished certainty. One system needed heroes to save it. The other tried to ensure it never would. The greatest battles of the Cold War were often invisible, fought not with tanks or bombers, but with mistakes, cover-ups, and moments no one could publicly acknowledge. And in the Petrov incident, the Soviet Union had suffered a strategic humiliation it could never admit. Officially, it never happened. There were no televised inquiries, no state honors, no restructuring of the alert protocol. The Kremlin couldn't allow the world or its own people to know how close it had come to pressing the button based on a glitch caused by sunlight bouncing off clouds. But inside closed chambers of power, the consequences rippled. The Petrov failure, though quietly buried, sparked a storm of silent corrections. High-ranking Soviet commanders began pushing for hardware upgrades, sensor recalibrations, and limited redundancy with ground radar. But it was all done under the guise of routine modernization. To admit otherwise would have been to reveal weakness, and in the Cold War, perception was survival. This internal tension between image and reality was the true battlefield, and it revealed a painful truth. The Soviet Union wasn't fighting the Americans anymore. It was fighting its own systems. Each attempt to repair the network highlighted the fragility of their command and control infrastructure. Western intelligence soon picked up signs of this internal friction, missed test launches, revised satellite flight plans, and abrupt changes to the command rosters at Serpukhov 15, the nerve center of Soviet space surveillance. Even more telling was the shift in doctrine. Soviet wargames began to reduce reliance on immediate retaliation. Contingency plans introduced delays between satellite detection and strategic response. But none of this was ever spoken aloud. The humiliation lay not just in the incident itself, but in the realization that their entire warfighting posture had been a house of mirrors, built on unproven assumptions. And it wasn't just the military that felt the sting. Politically, the Petrov incident dealt a silent blow to the narrative of Soviet infallibility. Here was a man who had done the right thing, acted with caution, used judgment, and for that, he was discarded. His story contradicted the myth of centralized control and obedient efficiency. It highlighted what Moscow feared most, that survival might depend on human imperfection. In the West, by contrast, the story leaked through cracks in the Iron Curtain. Western journalists picked up whispers of the man who saved the world. Though the full details remained classified for decades, the myth took root. It painted a portrait of the Soviet system not as powerful, but unstable, vulnerable to its own rigidity. That image stuck. For NATO strategists and U.S. policymakers, the Petrov incident became an internal case study, a reminder that deterrence was only as stable as the minds behind the missiles. It reinforced the need for back channels, cooler heads, and a policy of never pushing the USSR into a corner from which they might launch by mistake. In the quiet war of narratives, the Soviet Union lost this battle without a single shot fired, not because they were outgunned, but because they could not afford to admit they had been outsmarted by one of their own. The Soviet Union had always wrapped its military doctrine in the language of certainty. It was a system that worshipped precision, obedience, and ideological clarity, one in which weakness, hesitation, or doubt were not just unacceptable, they were unthinkable. But after September 1983, a quiet fracture spread through the core of that system. The Petrov incident wasn't a one-off glitch, it was a mirror, a moment when the Soviet war machine, so obsessed with being faster, deadlier, and more efficient than the West, had nearly destroyed itself based on a false image of 5 missiles. It wasn't an American decoy. It wasn't NATO deception. It was the USSR's own technology lying to its commanders and nearly triggering the apocalypse. And the ideology that had built that system, it could no longer explain what had happened. How could Marxist-Leninist command doctrine, rooted in absolute control and faith in machinery, account for a crisis averted only because one officer disobeyed protocol? It couldn't. The cracks became visible in other domains. Soviet scientists and engineers, once pressured to deliver perfect systems to the Politburo, began quietly whispering about the dangers of centralized decision-making. Junior officers across the strategic rocket forces started questioning the reliability of early warning networks. And by the mid-1980s, whispers turned into resignation requests. The myth of Soviet military omnipotence had taken a hit it would never recover from. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika emerged not just from economic necessity, but from a deeper realization the system's inability to adapt could get everyone killed. The rigidity that had defined the Red Army now looked less like discipline and more like suicidal inflexibility. Even worse, the West knew it. As U.S. confidence in its own command systems grew, NATO began pushing strategic boundaries, deploying cruise missiles in Europe, conducting more aggressive exercises, and investing in missile defense systems that further destabilized the Soviet deterrent. Each action chipped away at the one thing Soviet doctrine required, above all else, predictability. But perhaps the final ideological collapse came in the form of silence. Petrov was never honored. His name never appeared in official manuals. The event was never dissected in Soviet military journals. Because to admit what he had done, saved the world by not doing what the system demanded, would unravel the very logic on which the empire was built. And so the Soviet Union limped forward into the final years of the Cold War, armed with missiles, satellites, and a decaying ideology too brittle to accept its own near destruction. It hadn't been defeated by American firepower, economic pressure, or nuclear blackmail. It had been betrayed by its own belief in perfection. Stanislav Petrov died in relative obscurity in 2017. There were no parades, no medals from the Kremlin, no monuments, just a small apartment in Fryazino and the echoes of a night that never made it into history books. And yet, his decision, his moment of doubt still reverberates through every modern command bunker and satellite uplink. Because what he revealed wasn't just the fragility of a missile alert system, it was the fragility of belief in absolute certainty. The Cold War didn't end with mushroom clouds or final battles. It ended with a series of quiet collapses, some economic, some political, and some, like this one, existential. Today, Petrov's story lives on in NATO training manuals and American war colleges as a case study in decision-making under pressure. His hesitation is now hailed as wisdom, his disobedience a virtue. But those lessons came at the price of silence and erasure. In Russia, his name remains nearly unknown. But the systems that nearly doomed the world are not relics. They've evolved, but the dangers remain. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and autonomous defense networks are all built on layers of algorithms and assumptions, many of which still rely on the same flawed premise the Soviets believed in, that machines don't lie. But machines do lie. Sensors fail, alerts trigger, And in the chaos of information, sometimes it still comes down to one person staring at a screen, wondering, is this real? That's the ghost the Cold War left behind. It's not in the weapons or the treaties. It's in the quiet moments of judgment that determine whether nations live or die. So the next time a satellite image flashes red, or an alert blinks at 3 in the morning, someone, somewhere, will remember that once. A man named Petrov sat in a chair and said, "No, he wasn't celebrated, he wasn't trusted, but he was right. And the world is still here because of it."